And we continue with the second chapter of Emma in Winter by Penelope Farner. There is going to be a fan noise in the background that I hope you will excuse. It is truly winter here at Kentley Studios, and as I am recording, and I do need that heat to get through this. For the remaining week, Emma and Bobby had little to do with one another, or as little as it was possible to have when Miss Halibut constantly linked their names and called them out together to do things for her. Otherwise, Emma avoided Bobby, and Bobby, seeing she did it deliberately, avoided her as well, and yet, in the evening, sitting alone in his room, he thought about her considerably. Why this was, he did not know at all. He did not especially want to think about her when she clearly despised him so much, yet he could not help himself. He was now aware of his dreaming, not yet of what happened in the dreams themselves, where they continued to practice their flying, but at least of the fact that he did dream the same dream frequently, and that it was both strange and important to him. And he was beginning to wonder if the strangeness had something to do with Emma. The snow continued to lie on the ground, added to occasionally by new falls of snow, though none as great as the earlier ones had been. Everyone was beginning to forget how strange it was for snow to last more than a week. Indeed, they began to consider it quite normal after all, and would have been surprised to wake up in the morning and see it gone. That Saturday morning, Bobby's mother called to him from the hall, and coming reluctantly downstairs, he saw that she was smiling. "There you are, Bobby," she said. "Will you take baby out for an airing now and do some shopping for me in the village? You can get yourself some candy with the change if you like, and give baby some too." And Bobby was so pleased by her smiles and friendliness that he agreed quite eagerly, and hurried to pull on his rubber boots and wrap himself in scarves. But once out, pushing the baby carriage, he began to wish he had not been so eager after all. It was a majestic carriage, very black and shining, the baby jiggling about in it like a little beaming cherry, but it was not at all easy to push through the ice and snow. Bobby wished he was pulling a sled with runners, not pushing a carriage on wheels, and as he panted along, made plans and models in his mind for turning the wheels into runners before the next winter came. But for now, he had to manage with the carriage as it was, which either slid on ground as slippery as soap or skidded and bounced on the icy ribs that lay hidden beneath the newer and easier-looking snow. It was almost impossible for the wheels to get any proper grip, so that for much of the time he seemed to be pushing them bodily along. He did not know which was worse, the glassy ice or the powdery snow that the wheels had not force enough to push aside, and by the time he reached the properly sanded paths in the village, his face was like a great sun again, and he was panting and hot all over. And now, in the village, though the going was easier, he was afraid he might meet some other school-child while pushing the baby's carriage. But he went to the baker to buy buns, and to the supermarket for cabbage and bananas, and saw no one except the mothers of the children, who smiled at him quite friendly, and did not think it odd at all to see him there. And indeed, in all the village, there was scarcely a school-child to be seen. Walking on up the street to the post office, he understood at last why this was. In one place there was a clear view through the houses to the downs, to the very slope where they had gone sledding before, and he saw that it was crowded with little match figures climbing or coasting down. Of course, that was where all the children were. Bobby sighed with relief, and thought that if he was lucky, he might be safe after all, provided he avoided the butcher shop and Marley and Bandy Scragg, and he needed not go past there. So he went on up the street, quite carelessly, bouncing the baby in her carriage and making her laugh, and so he did not notice the small figure that came in sight around the corner at the end of the street, and which meant he was not safe at all. Then, seeing it, he looked wildly around for somewhere to hide, but short of cowering behind a mailbox or crouching in a bus shelter, to the astonishment of the other passer-by, there was nowhere he could go, so he had to walk on down the street, pushing the black carriage and the bonneted baby inside it. He went as slowly as possible, but nothing could do more than delay a little his meeting with Emma Makepeace. And there was no one he could think of. He would rather meet less than her. She had not yet seen him. She was carrying a bright, shining shopping bag that looked as if it belonged to some grown-up and not to herself. She was scuffing her feet in the snow and zigzagging along the pavement, not watching where she was going. Indeed, she did not look up at all until Bobby and the big black carriage were almost on top of her, and when she did, it was the carriage she saw first, before moving her eyes a little further ahead to see Bobby pushing it. But it was as if she only half recognized him, for she looked quite vague and in half recognition actually smiled. And then she knew him for certain, and the smile slipped away. But neither had paused for a moment. Bobby walked on quite briskly, returning her smile, and she walked past him briskly too, swinging the shopping bag and looking away from him across the road. Her cheeks had gone a little red, and her expression was still not the scornful one she usually wore, seeing Bobby. Indeed, if she had any expression on her face at all, it was one of embarrassment. Bobby was embarrassed too, and quite as red as she, and yet Emma had smiled at him, and he had smiled at Emma. He felt more pleased than he could have thought possible, so pleased that he almost ran the rest of the way to the post office and general store, the baby bouncing and beaming inside the carriage, and he quite forgot to take the back road to avoid Scragg's, the butcher shop, not caring if a million Marleys saw him pass and came to jeer at him. He even forgot to buy his candy at the candy counter with the change from his mother's stamps. Why should he want candy? For Emma Makepeace had smiled. He dreamt that night, but the dream had changed. It had been a good dream lately, his flying improving all the time, so that he was far better and faster than he had ever been during the flying summer. Emma ignored rather than laughed at him. The eyes had not come to frighten them. He had learned all the old delight in flying, and would have been happy to dream this dream forever. But tonight, the eyed thing was there again, and quite clearly was not satisfied with all that the two had learned. Whatever else it might be tonight, it became the most savage of teachers, so that their flying was like a lesson in physical education. Jerk and bend and jerk, turn and spin and jerk and turn again, until they ached and panted but still were allowed no rest. Even when so tired they felt they could scarcely move, their limbs seemed to carry on without them, as if they could not stop ever again, as if their limbs controlled them and not their as if their limbs controlled them and not they their limbs, as if they were seized in some frantic, enchanted dance. Bobby longed desperately for comfort and company. He turned his head toward Emma and saw that she needed the same, and all Emily was gone, her eyes and hands reaching out toward him or trying to, but there was one great wall between them, and no loneliness or longing could break. And both had to struggle on uncomforted. At school on Monday morning, Miss Halibut read out the monitor duties for the week. "I say, Emma," Bobby whispered across to Emma's desk before she had begun to read. "I say, Emma, sledding was smashing on Saturday. You should have come." He was bold because Emma had smiled at him. He had thought of nothing else all weekend, indeed, had half hoped to see her on the hill on Saturday afternoon, in case she would smile again. He had convinced her that she wanted to be friends with him. He had convinced himself that she wanted to be friends with him now. But Emma said, "Oh, was it?" "Oh, yes," said Bobby eagerly. "I say, Emma, why don't you try my sled one day? It's not bad, really. It gave me some good runs on Saturday." "Good runs?" said Emma. "I thought you always fell off before you started, Bobby Thumpkins." She was doodling in her nature book and did not sound as if she wanted to be friends with Bobby at all, so that he blushed and smiled and retreated sadly from her. And in any case, Miss Halibut was frowning in their direction, and they could not have gone on talking, even had Emma wanted to, which clearly she did not. But Bobby was obstinate today, and quite soon, though unable to talk to her, he managed to convince himself that Emma had only been teasing him, and was quite friendly after all, for on Saturday she had smiled at him, and he clung tightly to that. Miss Halibut was reading from her neatly lined list, glancing up now and then to pin her gray eyes on any child whose name she had just read, while the others waited expectantly. As in most schools, there were certain traditions about monitor duties among the children. Some duties were longed for by everyone, others nobody wanted. Blackboard duty, for example, they hated bitterly. It meant laying out chalk, cleaning the blackboards, and collecting up the odd ends of chalk, and had to be done at playtimes and in the dinner hour. Milk duty, on the other hand, they loved, for then you put out straws and milk cartons and collected them again, moving around importantly while the other children stayed working at their desks. "Milk monitor," read Miss Halibut toward the end of her list. "Milk monitor, Robert Thumpkins." Bobby saw the other children crane to look enviously at him. He was pleased with himself and smiling, the grin growing over his whole face. "Blackboard monitor," read Miss Halibut a little later. "Blackboard monitor, Emma Makepeace." At this, Emma was angrier than even Bobby had been pleased. Her face showed always precisely what she thought, and now it looked as if all its corners were turned down, eyes, mouth, even chin, and she muttered, it's not fair, I did more than anyone last term, too." And she dug her pencil so hard into her page that the lead snapped suddenly and rolled off her desk onto the floor with a tiny sound that only she and Bobby near her could have heard. Without thinking, not really even knowing what it was, Bobby bent to pick it up and of course saw nothing on the dark, huge-seeming floor, and had to straighten back in his chair, puffing and feeling a little silly, only to see Emma laughing at him. But he leaned to comfort her, even so, not aware, perhaps, quite how cruel her laughing was meant to be at this moment, in her anger. "Cheer up, Emma, it's hard work, but it's only a week, after all. My mother says a week goes by in no time these days." It made Emma stop laughing, but only to glare instead and turn her back on him without a word. Playtime that afternoon was indoors for the second time that day. It was a gray, grim, bitter day, and the snow was still deep in the schoolyard, except where the path had been dug, and Miss Halibut said she did not want them wet through with snowballing, and no dry clothes to change into, and in any case, it was really much too cold to go out, except to hurry home. But this meant that the children who had stayed at school for dinner, of whom Bobby and Emma were two, had been crowded since 9 o'clock into the smoky, dusty classroom, and were thus cross and cramped and bored and inclined to be quarrelsome. The novelty and excitement of the snow was beginning to wear off by now, certainly. Had it been a less crowded, stuffy day, perhaps Bobby would have had some sense. As it was, the stuffiness only made him more determined in a silly, almost frenzied way. Even had he noticed that all tempers were at dagger edge, he would not really have cared. He was only determined to show himself generous and kind, and so to make Emma be friends with him. She was sitting at her desk and reading a book, frowning a little as she read. "What are you reading, Emma?" Bobby asked. "Mind your own business," said Emma, her head still down. Bobby might have been warned, but he went on, determined as ever. "All right, then, I didn't really want to know," he said placatingly. "Why did you ask, then?" Emma was still pretending to read, her eyes on the book, but not traveling as they would have if she had been taking it in. Well, I just sort of wondered," said Bobby lamely. "I mean, it looked quite a good sort of book." "Why don't you go away?" Emma said. "Can't you see I want to read?" Bobby took a breath, puffing himself out. Then pink and stammering, his hands fiddling frantically with the wrapped candy in his pockets, he plunged into his huge attempt. "Look, Emma, I'll do blackboard duty for you this week. Miss Halibut will never see if I do it in playtime. Then you won't have to do blackboard duty ever again this term, and I'll do it next term too if you like. And if we could think of some way you could do my milk duty for me. Honest, I wouldn't mind. I wouldn't mind a bit, Emma." Being someone who moved slowly, Bobby tended to speak quite slowly, too, but now the words galloped out of him, trembling and slipping. "Shut up, can't you?" said Emma furiously. Go away, Bobby Fumpkins." "Honest, I wouldn't mind, Emma," pleaded Bobby. Emma slammed her book shut. "And who, except silly Bobby Fumpkins, wants to be milk monitor anyway? I don't. I'll leave it to silly boys who can't sit on sleds and push baby carriages in the street." "But," said Bobby, scarlet, But Emma, I meant it, honest." "Go away!" Emma was almost screaming now. "Go away, can't you? Mummy's boy, teacher's pet, fatty, fatty, fatty!" It was so loud and sudden that all the other children were turning to see what was happening. Craning and whispering, Bobby stood there in a dazed, still way, looking at Emma, scarlet-faced. He wanted to cry, but somehow managed to stop the tears, though he couldn't stop his mouth from trembling, or his skin from shivering underneath. After school, he went out without a word to anyone. Emma did not look at him. Bobby deliberately did not look at her, or Miss Halibut, or at any of the other children. He had run, despite the ice, down the cleared path, and out of the big iron gates before anyone else had even stepped out of the green school door. And in the post office store just down the road, he bought 2 bars of chocolate peppermint cream and ate them immediately as he went on his lonely way home. "Fatty," Emma had said. "Fatty, fatty, fatty!" That was what he really minded more than anything. "I don't care if I am fat. I don't care if I'm as fat as the man in the moon. I don't care what silly Emma says," but he did care, and he hated his chocolate even as he crammed it in. He ground it with his teeth as savagely as if he were biting up Emma and all her words. That night, the dream changed, for the second time in 3 nights, and now it was so dark that Bobby could see nothing at all, not the faintest glimmer of the snowy land beneath, if indeed it was still there. Now he was traveling, but if he was traveling, where was he going? There was nothing in the darkness to show him that. It was not even clear if the dark was in his eyes, like a kind of blindness, or whether it was in the atmosphere around him. The flight was a nightmare, a black, speedy rush, the passing air so swift that it choked and pressed on him, like falling in a dream in a deep, dark pit, except that he moved on the level here, horizontally, not vertically, down and down. At first he felt himself alone, seeing nothing, feeling only his own moving body, but gradually he sensed other movements, other beings quite close to him. At first he sensed most strongly that the strange eyes were there, watching him, though as he saw none of their glitter. As yet he saw none of their glitter. He sensed Emma there also, or at least the darkness lifting a little. Could see her, just a vague shape at first, then slowly more details. Her head and body, her face and hair, and eyes and nose and mouth. She looked terrified, streamlined by air, her dark hair pulled back to leave her face bare and unsheltered looking. He could feel his own hair and clothes pulled back also, and wondered if his face had such a scraped and naked look as hers. He became aware quite suddenly how frightened he was. And he was glad Emma was there, even cruel, jeering Emma, and he wondered if she was glad of his company also. He did not know why they were so frightened now. The feel of the eyes had gone away again before they had even seen them, but the dream remained terrifying in the blind, inexplicable way of nightmares. He tried to smile at Emma, stretching his face hard over the bones, but try as he could, no smile would come at all, his mouth remaining small and unfriendly. When he was a small boy, and he made a nasty face, his mother had used to tell him that the wind might turn his face stay that way. It felt just like that now, as if his face were stuck in a frowning, unfriendly mask, and looking at Emma, he saw that she wore the same stretched and desperate look that he must have, as if she too tried to smile and yet could not. He reached out his hands to see if he might communicate with her like that instead, but found a kind of solid wall in his way, against which his fingers crashed so hard that they curled up in pain. He could see nothing that could possibly have caused such pain, and wondered if it might be a wall of glass, because that is invisible, or nearly so. Yet even glass had some slight reflection, and he could not see so much as a reflection there. He tried his hands again, but more cautiously, and this time there was no wall, but something instead that actively pushed back, like a released spring perhaps, pushing his hands hard away. After that, he gave up trying to contact Emma and flew on desperately alone, and journeying he knew not where. And that is the end of chapter 2.